They thought she was just the janitor, quiet, invisible, wiping their floors while they sipped champagne in glass offices. For 15 years, she endured their whispers, their arrogance, their cruelty. But one day, the truth came crashing down. She wasn't just cleaning the company, she owned it. And the CEO who mocked her most was about to learn what true power looked like. Martha Johnson was a woman most people overlooked. Every morning, she arrived at the tall glass building of Benton and Steel Enterprises long before the sun had risen, pushing her old cleaning cart through the empty hallways. Her uniform was faded, her shoes squeaked, and her hands were rough from years of scrubbing floors and polishing marble. To most, she was simply the janitor, a shadow in the background of their corporate kingdom. But what they didn't know, what none of them ever cared to ask, was that Martha was more than she appeared. 15 years earlier, she had quietly invested the inheritance her late husband left her into the very company whose hallways she now swept. While others spent their dividends on luxury, she reinvested, purchased shares, and slowly accumulated a controlling interest. She never spoke of it, never flaunted it, never even hinted. To her, the janitor's cart was a mask, a way to stay grounded, to observe, to understand the soul of the company from the bottom up. And in those 15 years, she saw everything: the ambition, the cruelty, the exploitation, and above all, the arrogance of a man named Richard Benton, the company's CEO. Richard was the kind of man who thought the world was his stage. He barked orders like commands from a throne and dismissed anyone who wasn't useful to his ambitions. To him, Martha was invisible. He passed her in the hall without acknowledgement, dropped his empty coffee cups on her cart without a word, and once even mocked her in front of board members, joking, "At least the floors are cleaner than the numbers she'd ever understand." The boardroom had erupted in laughter, and Martha had smiled faintly, not because it didn't hurt, but because she knew something Richard didn't. The day would come when those same men and women would bow their heads to the janitor they had ridiculed. Still, Martha carried on with patience. She worked her shifts diligently, listened more than she spoke, and noticed details no one else did. She knew which managers treated their staff with respect, who cut corners, who embezzled, and who truly carried the weight of the company's success. She knew which projects Richard falsely claimed credit for and which ideas he quietly stole from junior employees. Every floor she polished reflected not just light, but a history of secrets she carried silently. For Martha, the building was like an open diary, and she had read every page. Her quietness wasn't weakness, it was strategy. The louder Richard boasted, the quieter she became. The more they overlooked her, the more power she quietly gathered. Each year when dividends were paid, Martha reinvested until one day she quietly crossed the threshold that gave her majority ownership. She signed the papers with steady hands, filed them away, and returned the next day in her uniform, pushing her cart, as though nothing had changed. Because for Martha, the real change wasn't in the stock certificates, it was in the timing. Timing mattered. Power revealed itself only when the right moment struck, like thunder after lightning. And Martha was patient enough to wait. It was a Wednesday when the moment began to unfold. Richard Benton was in rare form, his voice echoing through the building as he berated a young intern for spilling coffee on a presentation draft. The intern, barely out of college, stammered apologies while Richard sneered, "People like you belong cleaning the floors, not handling business." Martha, mopping just outside the glass-walled conference room, caught the words. Her grip tightened around the mop handle. For years, she had heard Richard's cruelty, but this time it wasn't just about arrogance, it was about dignity. And Martha had decided dignity was something worth defending. Later that day, Richard stormed past her cart, tossing a crumpled paper cup onto it without looking. Martha's eyes followed him, not with anger, but with a calm resolve that unsettled even her. She had tolerated his behavior for years, but the cup was the final straw, not the object itself, but what it symbolized, a man who believed some lives were disposable. That evening, long after the employees left, Martha walked into her small apartment and opened a drawer. Inside was a neat stack of documents, share certificates, voting rights, ownership papers. With a sigh, she placed them into a leather folder. She had waited long enough. The next morning, the company buzzed with news. An emergency board meeting had been called. Executives whispered, speculating about mergers, lawsuits, or acquisitions. Richard arrived late, smirking as always, certain he would dominate whatever the discussion was about. When the boardroom doors closed, Martha entered, not with her cart, not in her uniform, but in a navy blue suit that seemed to transform her completely. The room fell silent. Richard's eyebrows shot up, his lips curling in mock amusement. "What's this? Our janitor thinks she's invited to play executive dress-up," he sneered. But Martha didn't flinch. She walked to the head of the table and laid her leather folder before them. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice steady, "I believe you'll find the agenda today quite different from what you expected." She handed out copies of her ownership documents, each stamped, signed, and notarized. Murmurs filled the room. Pages flipped. Eyes widened. One by one, the executives realized the truth: Martha Johnson was not merely an employee. She was the majority shareholder. She owned Benton and Steel Enterprises. Richard laughed, a forced, bitter sound. "This is some kind of joke," he barked. "You expect us to believe the janitor owns this company?" But the lawyers present confirmed it. The paperwork was airtight. The shares were real. The signatures were valid. Richard's laughter faded into silence, his face draining of color as reality settled like a storm around him. Martha looked him straight in the eyes and said, "You may have built your empire on arrogance, Mr. Benton. But you built it on land that belongs to me." The aftermath of that revelation was seismic. Word spread through the company like wildfire: the janitor owned the business. Employees whispered in hallways, shocked and exhilarated. Some laughed at the irony, while others, especially those who had been mistreated by Richard, felt a surge of hope. Suddenly, the woman they had overlooked for 15 years wasn't just a silent figure in the background, she was the figure who could shape their future. Martha knew the responsibility was immense, but she also knew she had been preparing for this moment all along. The board members, still reeling, tried to regain their composure. Richard, red-faced and trembling with rage, slammed his fists on the table. "This is outrageous. You can't just walk in here and take over," he shouted. But Martha calmly slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward him. It was a termination notice. His name was printed clearly at the top, with her signature at the bottom. "Actually, Mr. Benton," she said softly, "I can. And I just did." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words sinking deep. Richard stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. For 15 years, he had strutted through those hallways like a king, never realizing the true queen walked among him in silence. Now, his reign was over. Security was summoned, and for the first time, Richard Benton walked out of the building not as a ruler, but as a man stripped of power. The sight of him being escorted through the same lobby where he had once ignored Martha was almost poetic. Employees peeked from cubicles, some hiding smirks, others whispering in awe. The janitor had fired the CEO. Martha didn't bask in the spectacle. She didn't raise her voice or revel in revenge. Instead, she returned to the boardroom, adjusted her papers, and addressed the team. "This company was built on the backs of hardworking people," she said. "For too long, their efforts have been dismissed while arrogance was rewarded. That ends today. From this moment forward, we build with respect, with dignity, and with fairness." Her words carried weight not because they were loud, but because they were true. For the first time in years, the employees felt a sense of possibility. The following weeks were transformative. Martha restructured leadership, promoting those who had been overlooked, especially the young intern Richard had mocked. She implemented programs for employee welfare, ensuring fair wages, opportunities for growth, and mentorship. She walked the hallways not as a distant executive but as a leader who listened. And though she wore suits to board meetings, she sometimes still pushed her old cart down the halls, not because she had to, but because she wanted to remind everyone, including herself, where she came from. It was never about hiding her wealth, it was about never forgetting her roots. Months later, the company stood stronger than ever. Profits grew, morale soared, and a culture of respect blossomed in a place once poisoned by arrogance. Martha's story spread beyond the walls of the company, making headlines across the country. The janitor who owned it all, they called her. She became a symbol of patience, resilience, and quiet power. People were fascinated not just by her hidden ownership but by the humility with which she wielded it. But Martha never saw herself as extraordinary. When asked by a reporter why she continued working even after gaining ownership, she smiled gently and said, "Because work is dignity. Every role has value. You don't have to sit at the top floor to matter." Her words resonated with millions, especially those who had been underestimated in their own lives. She became a living reminder that true strength doesn't always shout, it sometimes whispers until the right moment arrives. As for Richard Benton, he faded into obscurity, his downfall a cautionary tale whispered in corporate circles. He had once laughed at the janitor, never realizing she held his fate in her hands. And while he lived out his days in bitterness, Martha continued to build a legacy of kindness and fairness. She never needed to humiliate him further, the simple truth had already done that. Years later, as Martha prepared to retire, she walked the hallways one last time, running her hands along the walls she had polished for years. She looked into the offices filled with people who respected her not because of her wealth, but because of her humanity. And when she stepped out of the building, she didn't see herself as the janitor who became an owner, she saw herself as a woman who proved that power isn't about titles or appearances. Power is about patience, resilience, and knowing who you are even when the world doesn't. And so, the story of Martha Johnson ended not with vengeance, but with grace. She had been the silent witness to arrogance and cruelty, but she had also been the patient architect of justice. In a world where people often measure worth by what they see, Martha reminded everyone that sometimes, the person they dismiss as least significant may be the one who holds the key to everything. Never underestimate someone because of their job, their clothes, or their silence, because the quietest people often hold the greatest power. If this story moved you, share it to remind the world that dignity matters more than titles. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more stories that prove kindness, patience, and respect can change everything.